everybody today. We're here for our third year's presentation. We're going to go ahead and get started. Before each of the presenters comes up, we're going to have their research mentor come up and kind of introduce them a little bit. They will run through their presentations and share with you everything that they've worked really hard for the last year or so. And then from there, we'll move on with the rest of our day. So I think our first up is Rachel. So introducing her is going to be Dr. Meyer.
Welcome to my friends. I'm proud to introduce your first speaker, Rachel. Rachel and I spent this past year together working on her research project, which she will soon present to you. It's been a lot of fun. Some days, a lot of hard work, a lot of long hours. But without further ado, I'd like to present Rachel.
Okay, so my study is called A Literature Review of VNG and Web Testing, How to Incorporate a Pediatric Vestibular Assessment. So outline of what I'll be talking about today, I'm going to go over the background as to why I chose to look into this, how we found our articles, a summary of our results, conclusions, and then future directions we would like to take it. So when I started my third year project, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted to be more clinically based. And around the same time, I was hearing about kids getting concussions at younger ages. And in our classes in graduate school, we learned that head trauma can cause vestibular disturbances. So I was wondering if this was happening in children. So I searched and I found out that not only was it happening in children, but several other things in regards to our field cause vestibular disturbances as well, such as post-cochlear implantation, ear infections, migraines, and hearing loss. Just to give you an idea, the incidence of significant permanent hearing loss in one ear is 8 out of 1,000 children. And of those children, 80 to 90% could have vestibular disturbances. So once I figured this out, I know for adults, we have a gold standard on how to test the system for vestibular for adults. So I wanted to know if there was something for children. And I found out that there's no gold standard on how to test children's pediatric vestibular assessment. However, a lot of studies were doing rotary chair and posturography, which are two great assessments. However, in all of my clinicals in graduate school, I've yet to go to a place that has rotary chair or posturography. However, all the places I have been uses video nystagmography, or VNG, and vestibular evoked myogenic potentials, or VETs. So I wanted to look more into these issues these tests because they seem to be more readily available. So the aims of our study were to review the development and maturation of the vestibular and ocular motor systems, to see when it's developmentally appropriate to actually do these tests on children, and want to see if there's normative data for the test on children, and if not, when the systems are mature enough to be compared to adult normative data, and what's some modifications to the test battery to make them more child-friendly. So we started by searching the databases CINAHL, PubMed, Medline, ERIC, and HealthSource. We only looked for articles that were scholarly journals or peer-reviewed journals on children birth to 18 years and Englishly written. We searched terms like vestibular testing in children, pediatric vestibular assessments, disturbances in children, and then each of the subtests in regards to testing children. And we excluded studies that were strictly on VHIT, posturography, rotary chair, or articles that were on topics we weren't really searching, such as autism and dyslexia. We also searched the Cochrane database of systematic reviews to see if anything like this existed, and we did not find anything. And we also, once we found our articles, did a very extensive search through their references to make sure we weren't missing anything, and if we found anything that was useful, we used it and cited it accordingly. So what we found was the vestibular system is developed at birth and matured by 2 months of age. There's more variability in the development and maturation of the ocular motor system. And the reason we look at these two systems is because they are 2 out of the 3 systems that maintain balance. And also because of the vestibular ocular reflex, or the VOR, which is when there's eye movement in response to head movement. So for example, if you're looking forward and you turn your head to the right, your eyes would stay on the target. That's your vestibular system telling your ocular system, I made a movement, and the ocular system saying, yep, I corrected for it. So they work hand in hand. So we're going to talk about the VNG, which tests the vestibular and the ocular motor systems. It's broken into 4 groups of tests: ocular motor, positionals, positioning testing, and clorks. So the first of the ocular motor test is a saccade. And a saccade is a quick eye movement without moving your head to keep a target on the fovea. So it could be just looking at your fingers back and forth, or watching the smiley face move across the screen. There was no normative data for this test, but we wanted to look at to see if you were to obtain normative data when a person could developmentally do this study. The study showed 2 weeks to 2 months. Until normative data is collected, though, you have to compare it to adult normative data. You can start doing that at 5 to 14 years. The next ocular motor test is Optogenetic, and this is watching a rotating object keeping a rotating object on the fovea. Sort of like watching a train go by, or watching these smiley faces go by. Again, there was no normative data for this test, but children can developmentally do it at 3 to 6 months, and you can compare it to adult normative data at 3 to 7 years. The next ocular motor test is Pursuit, and this is watching a moving target go back and forth at a constant rate, sort of like watching a pendulum go back and forth, or the smiley face go back and forth. Again, there is no normative data for this test, but children 1 to 8 months are developmentally able to do this test, and their system is mature enough to be compared to adult normative data at 5 years, starting at 5 years. The last of the ocular motor test is gaze, and gaze is staring at a target for a longer period of time than the other tests. The target would move, and you would stare at the target for new location. Some studies don't consider this an ocular motor test, but we did because we used the ocular tract, so we decided to consider it an ocular motor. Again, there was no normative data for this test as well, but children as young as 6 months are developmentally able to do the test, and you can start to compare it to adult normative data at 12 to 18 months. The next group of tests is positionals, and positionals is testing for dizziness or nystagmus in different positions. The positions are sitting up, lying down, as in picture 1, lying down with your head turned to the right or to the left, as in picture 2 and 3, or lying down with your full body turned to the right or to the left. We kept quite a lot of information on this test specifically, but everything we kept reading was that the criteria and the parameters are no different between children and adults. So from that information, we inferred that since the vestibular system is matured by 2 months, you could do this on a 2-month. The next group of tests are the Dix-Hall peg and the roll maneuver. So the Dix-Hall peg is shown in this picture, and you turn the patient's head 45 degrees to the right or to the left, and you lie them down on the table or the chair, whatever you're using, and let their head dangle a little bit, but you support it. This is testing for benign paroxysmal positional vertigo, or BPV, of the posterior semicircular canal. The other test is roll maneuver, and this is testing, you lay a patient on the table and you just turn their head to the right, keep it there for 30 seconds, turn your head to the left, keep it there for 30 seconds, and you're just looking for a certain eye movement. And this is testing for BPV in the horizontal semicircular canal. Again, for these tests, we did not find that there was any difference between parameters and criteria between adults and children, so we inferred that you could do this at 2 months or more. So the last of the tests in the VNG is clorks, and this is when you put warm or cool air into the ear, or ice water, but air is preferred. And you put it at 45 degrees and you just put the air or water in their ears. Again, we found there was no difference in the test parameters for this test as well, and children developmentally as young as 6 months have been able to do this test. However, we did find normative data available for air clorks on 2 to 10-year-olds and for ice water clorks for 1 to 2-year-olds. The last test that we wanted to discuss is a test on its own, and it's called Vestibular Evoked Biogenic Potentials, or VEPS. And this is testing muscle potential changes to acoustic stimulation. So we're specifically going to talk about the cervical vent, or the C-vent, and this is when we put electrodes on the sternocleidoid masto muscle. And the patient is to contract this, and then we just look at muscle potential changes and their acoustic stimulation. Children as young as 1 month are able to do this test, and there is normative data available for 3 to 11-year-olds. So this table right here is just showing a summary of kind of what I just talked about. So again, a lot of the tests did not have normative data. So until normative data is obtained, you'd have to compare it to adult normative data. But if you were to obtain normative data, you'd have to know when a subject can developmentally even do the test. And that's what this table is showing you. So on your left, it'll be the tests broken down. In the middle is the ages that studies report, and then on the right side is the actual studies. There was a lot of variability with ocular motor, as you can see. But that's just because none of the studies did the exact same thing. They used different targets, they used different distances from the target, they tested different ages. There was no symmetry, which is why there's a lot of variability. However, the entire test value could be done developmentally on a 1-year-old. The next table is showing us, since there's not normative data, when you can compare it to adult normative data. So when the system's matured enough to be compared to adult normative data. Again, on your left, it's the test broken down. The middle is the years of the study's report, and then on the right is the studies. Again, there was variability on ocular motor tests for the same reasons. However, several studies report that you can do this entire test on 5 minutes. So some modifications. So for the ocular motor test, studies suggest using larger targets, more fun targets, such as these here. Studies we read, one used elephant heads, one used Mickey Mouse heads, and the other one used smiley faces like I did today. It also suggests to do the most meaningful test first, depending on the symptoms. And if you get an abnormal result, to do it again to make sure it is in fact abnormal. For positionals and positioning tests, they suggest letting the child lay in the caretaker's arms to make them more comfortable, as seen in this picture, and to encourage them throughout to make them just stay motivated. For caloric testing, we usually put the air or water in an adult's ear for 1 minute. For children, you can do it for 30 seconds. And for adults, we usually do warm and cool air, and for children, you can do it monotherapy. So for the vent modifications, so like I said earlier, for the CVEM, an adult would have to contract their sternocleidomastoid muscle for up to 20 seconds. That might be hard for a child to do. So there are devices, like seen in this picture, where if a child is stimulating that muscle enough, SpongeBob, part 2 would turn on. Now, if he were to relax so much that would inhibit results, SpongeBob would turn on. So that's just a way to keep the child motivated during the test. We also suggest, if it's an infant, to just lay them on the caretaker's arms and to just turn their head to the right or to the left, whichever way. And for older subjects, if you don't have this test, to have them put their head down and turn to activate that muscle. So conclusions. There is no gold standard to test children's pediatric system. Since we didn't find normative data except for calorics and CVEM, we suggest that you can start comparing the results at 5 to 5-year-olds. So if you have a kid that comes in that's younger than 5, we suggest you doing calorics and CVEM because there is normative data for younger ages for these tests. If these tests do not give you the information that you need, then we suggest you refer out to someone that does rotary chair and posturography and specializes in testing children. And we suggest using testing modifications. So the future directions, we would like to collect normative data for all the tests. And we'd like to survey current audiologists working in the field, especially with children, to see if they come across this demographic a lot, and if not, are they asking about the balance of the vestibular system in the case history? Because I know before I did this project, I never thought to ask about a child's balance system. And to survey pediatricians to see if they come across this a lot, and if so, who are they referring out to? Is it physical therapists, occupational therapists, or audiologists? So that's the end of my presentation, but before questions, I would like to thank Megan Davis and Katie Plaxa, who came in at a very stressful time who needed extra hands and provided those extra hands. I know how busy you two are, so I really appreciate it. To Dr. Menino for sharing your research wisdom with us, for proofreading my poster. I personally know how busy you are, and I really appreciate it. And to Dr. Meyer for taking on a student for the first time, for working long nights. We were in the office one day till 10:30. Working weekends. I know how busy you are, and I really appreciate it. It was fun, and I learned a lot. And yeah. So, American, please. Questions? Yeah. Thank you. Any questions? Okay, cool, great.
I don't know.
We got excited. We were ready.
I'm Jeff DiGiovanni, faculty member in Communication Science and Disorders, and I had the pleasure to have Carissa said. And to either perform a third-year project. And we have transitioned. We used to do a lot of hearing aid research over the years. And about 4 or 5 years ago, we transitioned to a new area, looking at working memory in the auditory system. And we cut our teeth for a few years and finally got some really good data going. And with the help of Chris and Jenny, we have a pretty darn good study that was presented at the American Auditory Society. And welcome, and very much so applauded. So they worked tirelessly through this process and got their minds around new concepts, and were not afraid to stretch their minds, and not afraid to tell me how bad my jokes were. Very valid. Very valid. So without further ado,
Does anyone have any questions? We're not good with technology. I mean, like classroom technology, we just look over.
I don't have it, but that's
The lights on time. Okay, yeah, lights on time. There it is.
All right, keep the party going. So as Dee Dee said, my name's Ben Michael, and
I'm Chris and Gilmore.
we did our third-year research project in the Auditory Psychophysics and Signal Processing Lab with Dr. D. Giovanni and our second lab dad, Travis Riffle. Our study is titled Generalization and Resilience in Auditory Working Memory. So a little bit of background on our project. So, speakers don't work. This is supposed to be background noise. So listening and background noise is much more challenging. So anytime you've been to a restaurant, a bar, and you're trying to have a conversation with someone, you know it's a lot more difficult to have that conversation than if you're just talking to someone in a one-on-one environment. So, it's okay. Pretend there's background. There's the background. So, as you can see, it's a little bit harder to understand me when there's background noise playing. Perfect example. So your brain is, researchers have looked at this over the years, and they found that it's harder because your brain is focusing on a task at hand, such as listening and noise, and trying to also ignore the background noise that's coming in. So, this is happening automatically, relatively automatically. You're not consciously thinking about it, for the most part. So you're not saying, oh, okay, I'm going to be listening to Rachel, but ignoring DG's splash going on over there and all this going on. Your brain is just doing it for you. And the point of our study is proven. So researchers have looked at what causes this. What is a good indication of people doing well listening and background noise? And a lot of researchers found that working memory plays a large part in cognitive processing and comprehension. So what is working memory? Working memory is the ability to have an incoming stimulus, hold and process that information, and then do a task. So in our example, information's going to come in. So you hear something through your perceptual, auditory, vision, whatever system you may choose. Then you have to hold and process that information, and attention plays a very key role in this concept. So this is the central component of working memory. Once you process that information, there's an action that happens. So the action doesn't have to be a physical action. It could just be making a decision or understanding a concept. So further research has looked at, well, how do we sort out working memory? How do we use this as a task, a divider between participants? So previous research, when we were reading the literature, showed that there's high and low working memory groups, and that's how a lot of researchers separate out their data. So we talk about working memory capacity. Working memory capacity is that nice dark green part. So working memory capacity is the person's ability to store how much you can store and how much you can process at one given time. So people with higher working memory capacity are better able to hold and process information, and they also have the ability to perform other tasks that are going on. They kind of have extra room left over. And people with lower working memory it's just a less amount of things that they can hold and process while doing other tasks. So our questions for our study were, why are some people better able to ignore distractions, auditory distractions in their environment? And how resilient are people to new distractions coming in? And then lastly, we want to look at, can they generalize these abilities to different tasks? Our study was motivated by Patrick Sorkvist, who did a lot of research, who's done a lot of research in auditory working memory, high and low working memory groups. So in one of the studies that was kind of the main focus of ours, he looked at visual and auditory distractions. So on the screen, there was arrows that would come up, and a participant would have headphones on. And the arrows would come up, and they'd have to say if it was a right or a left arrow. And then there would also be auditory distractions thrown in, and they looked at how reaction times changed. So we wanted to extend these findings, but just using the auditory domain. So we used different distractors, and we wanted to further expand it into different experimental task paradigms. So our hypotheses were that overall higher working memory groups would be better able to adapt to these tasks than the lower working memory group, and that they would be better able to generalize this information and just have overall better results.
So this is how our study was set up for each of the experiments. In experiment A, people were presented with a standard auditory distractor, which is this part right here. In experiment B, they got that standard distractor 90% of the time, and then a deviant distractor 10% of the time. Then in experiment C, they got that same standard 90% of the time, but a different deviant 10% of the time. And in experiment D, we changed the task a little bit, but they had the same deviant as experiment C. So, a little rundown of what happened if you were running in our study.
Thank you to those of you who did.
So the participants would see either a red or a blue square, which indicated either the right ear for the red square or the left ear for the blue square, and that was the ear that they were supposed to attend to. Then they would hear that distractor tone, either the standard or the deviant, depending on which experiment and what percent of the time they were getting it. Then they would hear simultaneous numbers in their ears. So in this case, they get a 3 in the left ear and a 6 in the right ear. Then they were asked, is the number you attended to smaller or bigger than the other number? So in this case, they were given the blue square, so they're attending to the left ear. 3 is smaller than 6, so they're going to push that negative or the minus sign on the keyboard. In this example, we've got the red square, they hear the distractor tone, 9 is bigger than 8, so they're going to push the plus sign. In experiment D, we gave them the same exact rundown up till here. They were asked if the number was odd or even in the ear they were attending to, so they pushed either an O or an E on the keyboard. We used 27 participants' data in our study. They needed 75% accuracy or better to be included, and they were given the auditory working memory screener, the Wilcox Johnson 3, before
I know, you can't look out there.
they were given the Lookup Johnson 3 screener to determine whether they would be in the high or the low working memory group. So we used a median split to determine our two groups. If they scored a 13 or higher, they were our high working memory group, and if they scored a 12 or lower, they were our low working memory group. So that brings us to our results. Here we've got experiment B. You can see the red circle indicates our statistical significance in this chart. On the left side here, we've got their mean response time. Up top is slower, and down at the bottom is faster. And then as we go across the bottom here, we've got the block number for the experiment. So for each experiment, they did 5 blocks of 50. Then we see the dotted lines are the reaction to the deviant distractor, which was at 10% of the time. And then the solid lines are the reaction to the standard. The white circles and triangles are the low working memory group, and the black circles and triangles are the high working memory group. So as we see, there's a statistically significant difference during that first part when they first heard this new distractor tone, that deviant, between each group's deviant and standard tones. What we also see is a general trend of the low working memory group starting out worse and then remaining a little bit slower than that high working memory group. Each group got better, but the high working memory group got a lot better. As we go to experiment C, we see the same type of thing. And again, this was a different deviant, so it was a new sound for them. So both groups started out a lot slower with that deviant tone. There was a statistically significant difference for both groups between their deviant and standard times here as well. And then we see the same general trend of them getting better, but the higher working memory group getting just a little bit better than the lower working memory group. Then we move to experiment D. Here they had the same deviant tone, so we don't see that huge gap at the beginning like we did for the other experiments because they're already used to both of the sounds that they heard for distractors. But we still see that general trend of low working memory group just being overall slower. Then we come to our experiment totals. So you see here the bottom changed a little bit. We've got experiment B, C, and D. And here we're just looking at the trend of low working memory group again overall was just a little bit slower and didn't adapt quite as well as the high working memory group did. So in summary, high working memory group better at new distractors than the low working memory group, and both groups were able to generalize to new tasks.
So, in conclusion, our study results indicate that, as we predicted, higher working memory groups would be better able to adapt to auditory distractors than the low working memory group, and that overall the higher working memory group did perform better. So, for future studies, we hope to examine further the generalizability of these tasks, harder tasks. So our odd and even was fairly simple. If you had to listen to your left ear and it was an odd number, it was an odd number. And it was a change in task, but it was little cognitive processing. So we hope to expand that to using more cognitive processing or harder tasks. We also hope to use different distractors and to test that resilience to different auditory distractors. And then the further down the road would be to examine if these auditory distractors, if there's still resilience in language comprehension, if this can generalize to something that's larger than just playing numbers into both of your ears, like reading a passage, studying in the library, something like that. We want to say thank you very much to our fantastic lab family. We seriously couldn't have done it without you. And KDK, and Mom and Chelsea, thank you so much. We had so many hands helping us throughout the whole project. And to our class, who's been there through and through. That's a great picture. Does anyone have any questions?
In your study, did you do anything with trying to teach the local resilient group methods of learning to get better or surpass the higher resounding group?
We didn't in this study, but that's actually one of the goals for way down the road once we are able to look at this a little bit more, to do something like a brain training and see if that would help people who have lower working memory improve their working memory capacity so that they can be better at it. Something like lumosity, if you guys are familiar with that, it's sort of like a brain training thing. So that's where one of the ideas for this came from, is to hopefully eventually get to that point.
My name is Jen. It is my partner, Megan, who is with me in the past almost 3 years. And we had the opportunity to get Taiwan and get data on the babies and adults. And we come back with the help of supplements. We were able to focus on little babies. And Megan was very brave to say, hey, let's do it on the adults. It was cool.
And my project looked at the exponential modeling of human frequency following responses to voice pitch in both American newborns and adults. So what does that mean? Well, voice pitch can be an important cue for speech understanding across all languages, tonal or non-tonal. So English, which is a non-tonal language, just by changing the pitch or intonation of our voice, we can change a statement, such as, we have colloquium today, into a question. We have colloquium today? So just by changing the pitch or intonation of my voice, you could clearly tell the difference between those two sentences. Voice pitch in tonal languages, such as Mandarin Chinese, just by changing the pitch or intonation of your voice, can change the meaning of the word entirely. So these are Mandarin tones that we use in our lab. They're similar to the English vowel E. Mallory and Derek will also be talking about them, but I will introduce all of them to you now. They are tones 1, 2, 3, and 4. Each of them has a different pitch contour at the fundamental, which you can think of as the original waveform. And then also you can see the subsequent harmonics of each tone, which are multiple integers of that fundamental frequency. Okay, so all 4 of these tones have different pitch contours as well as different meanings. So I will play them for you now and tell you that. So tone 1 has a flat contour and means clothing. Tone 2 has a rising contour and means aunt. Tone 3 has a falling then rising contour and means chair. And then tone 4 has a falling contour and means easy. Okay, now we're all in. Okay, so why is any of this important? Well, across languages, despite them being tonal or non-tonal, there have been deficits in pitch perception when it comes to those individuals who have hearing impairment or autism, for example. So what can we do to capture our perception of pitch? So something that we use in our lab is called the frequency following response, or FFR. It's a non-invasive electrophysiological measure that provides insight into those pitch coding mechanisms of the auditory system from the brainstem level. Something that's extremely important to these recordings is what is called the signal-to-noise ratio, or the SNR. So the response that we are attempting to obtain is extremely small, somewhere around hundreds of nanovolts, whereas the background noise in a recording could be anywhere between 100 to 200 times larger than that. So to improve the signal-to-noise ratio, we need to increase the number of sweeps, or stimulus repetitions. However, such as with everything in life, there's a trade-off to that. The more sweeps we have, the more time it's going to take to achieve that response. So this will be an animation that I'll go through. This is just a response spectrogram from one particular individual in my study. As I move through the animation, you'll notice a few things. The first is the number of sweeps will increase. So will the amount of time, but also we'll start to see the presence of a response become more prominent. So right now we're only at 100 sweeps and about 30 seconds in, and there's no response happening here, which is to be expected. So as we move through into 200, into 500, and finally into 1,000 sweeps, we're starting to see the presence of this response here, denoted by the dark red color. And we're almost to about 5 minutes of testing time now. Move into 2,000, and finally into 4,000 sweeps. We have a nice, robust response here at the fundamental frequency, and you can even see it has that rising pitch contour like E2 does. But we're almost to about 20 minutes of testing now. Finally, into 6,000 and into 8,000 sweeps, this particular participant's brainstem did a really great job at following the contour. The amplitude has now, or the response has turned white. So you can imagine the amplitude is kind of jumping off the page at this point. It's so large, their brainstem's tracking it so well. But also note, they're almost at 40 minutes of testing time now. So as you can imagine, there's clearly a trade-off here. So when we test our newborn babies, especially, time really is of the essence. We want to, responses are best obtained when the participants are fast asleep and very quiet, and that's likely not going to happen with a newborn baby between 1 and 3 days old. So we want to get that robust, reliable response, but in a decent amount of time. So how do we find the happy medium? Well, in 2011, Zhang and colleagues quantified the FFR response of Chinese adults and then derived an exponential model from their data. So this graph is showing a 60 dB NHL stimulus, and as we increase the number of sweeps on the x-axis, the tracking accuracy is improving and then leveling off, and an exponential equation is derived, which you can see here inside the graph. So if we know the trend, we can model it. The linguistic experience of a Chinese adult is likely much different than the linguistic experience of an American newborn or an adult. So a computer model designed specifically for this population is imperative in order to firstly shorten testing time, finding that happy medium, also to give us more information about the nature of pitch processing at the brainstem for this population, and then also to hopefully develop therapeutic protocols down the line. Which leads me to my research question, which is what are the fitted frequency following response trends for both American newborns and adults? And I hypothesized that the adults would exhibit stronger, robust trends due to their mature neural circuitry as well as their linguistic experience. So we looked at 12 American newborns with normal hearing between 1 and 3 days old, and then 18 American adults were recruited with English as their native language. They were between the ages of 20 and 40 years old, and it was also required that they be non-musicians, since evidence has shown that musicians are able to track pitch more efficiently due to their musical background. I used the E2 stimulus parameter, which means aunt, and I can play it for you one more time. So that's what my participants heard the entire time during testing over and over again while they were trying to sleep. It was presented until about 8,000 sweeps were accepted, and it was presented to the right ear at 75 dB SPL. So they had 3 gold-plated electrodes on them, one on the high forehead, one on the low, and one on the right mastoid. Again, they were encouraged to rest as peacefully as possible, and it was better if they fell asleep. So running in my study wasn't bad. And the impedance was kept under 3 kiloohms. 3 objective indices were applied in order to calculate the pitch tracking accuracy as well as the phase locking magnitude of each participant. So frequency error measures the accuracy of the pitch encoding during stimulus presentation. Tracking accuracy looks at the overall faithfulness of the pitch tracking between the stimulus and the response. And then pitch strength is just as it sounds. How robust of a response do we have from the brainstem? So these are the grand average spectrograms for the American newborns with the number of sweeps noted at the top. So we have 100 to 1,000 and then 2,000 to 8,000 sweeps here at the bottom. So we can notice a few things as we move through. The first being that the presence of a response is denoted by the bright yellow color at the fundamental frequency here, and that only becomes more prominent as we increase the number of sweeps. Also, we start to see the presence of those harmonics come into play, even at around 2,000 sweeps. We can start to see the presence of those harmonics, which are the darker red color. Also, we can note that the contour of the response has that rising pitch contour, just like the stimulus does. These are the grand average spectrograms for the adults. Again, similar things can be noted. As we move across or increase the number of sweeps, that response is becoming more prominent, the bright yellow at the fundamental. We start to see the presence of the harmonics in the adults even sooner than we did with the newborns. So even at 500 sweeps, we start to see that first harmonic come into play, which it wasn't until about 2,000 or 4,000 sweeps in the newborns. And if I switch back to the newborns quickly, another look, and then go to the adults, you can notice that the adult spectrograms are a little bit cleaner, or what we call less noisy. So the presence of a response in the adults is prominent even at 100 sweeps. Whereas with the newborns, it was kind of there, just not as robust until we increased that number of sweeps. Okay. So these next figures will be the FFR data by index, those three indexes that I talked about. So on the x-axis here, we have the number of sweeps. On the y-axis, we have frequency error. The adults are in purple and the newborns are in red, and that remains true throughout the rest of the figures I'll show you. So for frequency error, we can notice two things. The first, that as we increase the number of sweeps or move along that x-axis, both groups are decreasing in their frequency error, which is what we want. We want error to decrease as sweeps increase. So both groups are doing so, decreasing and then kind of leveling off, and the adults are doing so at a faster rate than the newborns. Pitch strength, similar pattern, sweeps on the x-axis, pitch strength on the y. As we increase the number of sweeps or move along that x-axis, both groups are increasing in their pitch strength. Again, the adults doing so at a faster rate than the newborns. And finally, with tracking accuracy, number of sweeps on the x-axis, tracking accuracy on the y this time. Both groups are improving in their ability to track the change in the pitch. Again, the adults doing so at a faster rate than the newborns. All right, so these three figures show the fitted curve equations for the three indices, along with their exponential equations within each one, and also their coefficient of determination, or R squared. And that tells us how good of a fit do we have of this curve to the data, right? So both tracking accuracy and pitch strength, since they had ascending trends, this exponential model was used here, where A is just some objective measure such as tracking accuracy or pitch strength. N is the number of sweeps that are used in the averaging process. AAS represents the asymptotic amplitude, or where that curve kind of starts to level off. So even in the previous figures and in these ones, you can kind of notice a leveling off point in all of them, and that's what that represents. E is Euler's number, it's just a mathematical constant that's used. T, or tau, represents it's the time constant of the fitted curve. So at what point, or what number of sweeps have we reached at least 63% of that asymptotic amplitude, or that leveling off point? And then finally, A noise represents the amplitude of the noise in the recording. And then frequency error uses a similar equation. However, A noise and AAS are just simply flip-flopped to denote that decreasing trend for frequency error. So, the exponential model used in this study provided a good, if not great, fit to the FFR trends across all three indices, with a mean R squared value of 0.89 for the newborns and 0.96 for the adults. So the closer to 1 we are, the better. So both of those are pretty good. Also, this shows that the use of an exponential model to mathematically analyze the FFR trends is useful. There was a significant difference between groups when it came to all three indices, which confirms my original hypothesis that the adults would exhibit a more robust response trend. One of the kind of more interesting results I thought is, despite the fact that English is labeled as non-tonal, it is clear that prosody cues still are really important in the English language, and that we only improve upon them from our postnatal days, as was seen in the spectrograms and in the FFR data. And also, now that a newborn exponential model has been derived for American newborns, this has yet to be accomplished yet. So now that it has, this could be used for any potential commercialization process in the future. So the happy medium is achievable with exponential modeling. We can get that good response in a decent amount of time, which is imperative when it comes to our newborns. And this process could be used clinically as part of initial newborn screening, and that could give us a good idea of any future pitch processing disabilities down the line. I just, of course, want to thank Dr. Jang. This is he and Mallory and I presenting our research in Taiwan 2 summers ago now. And then, of course, my fellow lab mates, Mallory and Garrett. And then, of course, to Hallie and Katie, they actually collected the newborn data 2 summers ago as part of ongoing research in our lab. So thank you to that, and of course, my family and friends, and all my other classmates. And any questions? No, definitely, I knew it. I know, I was waiting.
This is a great presentation of beautiful data. So what you show
two theories at play here is if we're born with the ability to track the changes in voice pitch or if we improve upon it as we age and have more experience in our language. So that's what a lot of the difference is. We are able to do it when we're 1 to 3 days old, but we're just not as good at it until we've obviously been out experiencing the language in our everyday lives. Building upon that, and whether it be tonal or non-tonal, you'll improve upon the language you're exposed to.
I found the other thing that's also very interesting is I found in your slides that the infants would have stronger harmonics versus in the FFR. And that's, counterintuitive
Yeah,
to what you just said.
right.
But I found that's fascinating because the central auditory system becomes sluggish, but is on a developmental trajectory.
Right.
So what do you say about that?
I do know that especially with the newborns, especially we looked at it with Chinese newborns, and they are able to, if we looked at Chinese newborn FFRs and then looked at Chinese adults, they still have the harmonics in their responses, whereas with adults, English adults, we don't have that tonal language. So we kind of lose those slight changes in pitch that most people who speak Mandarin Chinese or tonal language improve upon and are around it every day. So it kind of would make sense that the adults, we kind of lose it after a while because we're not as keen to it. I think she's good, right?
It's me again. It has been a great pleasure to have Garrett working with me, and he has been in the lab, and I like to say he's the man of because my office is on the second floor, and my lab is on the first, and I have been struggling with the distance in the recent years because I'm getting lazy to go downstairs. And so when he is actually in charge, I think he did a lot of improvements for the lab, physically and mentally. And so he fixed the table that will never touch the power wire again. The thing, I'll show my presentation here. I admire his creativity because we had ongoing projects in our lab. And I asked him, do you want to do one as you pretty flashy? He said, no, I want to do one for myself. I said, wow. That's a spirit I really admire. And so he actually came to me with his own idea and we actually did it. And can you imagine the brain's response to human speech versus machine speech? Oh, half and half.
Thank you, Dr. Zhang. I appreciate that. My name is Garrett Mayhew. Megan, thank you so much. You have the great pleasure of hearing 3 speeches on frequency follow response. You did a great job of introducing FFR as part of mine as well. I do want to say that the process of collecting the data for the FFR is identical. We have the 3 gold-plated electrodes, just as in Megan's studies, and the right ear was stimulated with the ER38 headphone, as in Megan's study. And so that is where the similarities kind of fade away. This is subcortical pitch representation in response to human and synthesized speech stimuli. I'm part of the Auditory Electrophysiology lab here at Ohio University, and in that lab, again, we look at how the brainstem is processing and codes pitch perception, pitch, sorry. And in that lab, we use a lot of recorded human speech, as Megan had you listen to a few minutes ago. And, while that's a really great method, it creates great viability of FFR responses. There are other research out there, as for instance, Northwestern University, Dr. Cross, they use a synthesized DOS stimulus to create their FFR recordings. So I'm sitting here thinking, well, why is that good? You know? And the good news about that is when you're using recorded or human speech, we need to, if you're comparing it against two different stimuli, you need to normalize that data. So you need to make the times the same, you need to make the amplitudes the same, and all of those little nuances you have to kind of change with the stimulus. When you make so much of those changes, you're kind of degrading the responses, you're degrading the human speech a little bit. It becomes unnatural. And you have to be careful how far you're moving some of the parameters. So with the synthesized, we want to kind of move towards that because you have complete control of every parameter that's embedded within a synthesized speech token. You can make it sound as natural, as unnatural as you want it to. You can change the time, and you can smooth things out a little bit easier because you have that total control. Having that total control, I think, will give us better research from the Auditory Electrophysiology lab, and therefore bring Ohio University better research as well. So in order to move to this, we have to actually test and make sure that the synthesized speech token that I created was going to actually work. The DOS stimulus clearly works for Northwestern University, but I'm actually synthesizing the Mandarin E2 token, or the ANT that Megan had played for you, and I am going to play that again for you, just for you guys. So in order to make the synthesized stimulus, I used a program called BRAT, and let me tell you, I've never synthesized speech a day in my life. This was a very challenging project, and I really did enjoy learning how to do this. The first attempt I made it, I ran to Dr. Zhang's lab, I played it for him. It didn't sound anything like human speech at all. But at the moment I thought it did, and he was kind of looking at me like, there needs to be work done. So, 15 or 20, 25, tokens later, I finally came to one that I thought would give me viable results in the FFR. So, I will say that my E2 token is only 150 milliseconds long, so it's a little shorter than what that she played for you, so you hear that slight change. So this is the recorded speech token. E2 means ANT. It's a human speech, if I can get my cursor to work. Okay, my synthesized speech token. And then this one is a hybrid speech token that we created in the lab. It has an envelope that's recorded in E2, and it has noise as the fine structure. We kind of wanted to give that hybrid option as well. And that's, I don't know why I can't see this. And that's what that sounds like. Not very pleasant. So that's what my participants listen to.
You're studying.
Of course, the aims of this study is to elicit FFR responses in Chinese adults using recorded, hybrid, and synthesized speech tokens. We looked at 3 objective indices, like Megan's study as well did: the pitch strength, or the overall robustness of the brainstem response. Frequency error, how much does it deviate from that fundamental frequency, and tracking accuracy is how well does it go within that fundamental frequency. So my research question was, what does synthesized speech, or how does synthesized speech tokens affect the brainstem's ability to process pitch contours? And my hypothesis was that even though I've never synthesized speech a day in my life, I think this is going to work out pretty well. I don't think there's going to be any significant differences between my synthesized speech token and the recorded speech token. My second hypothesis was that the hybrid speech token that we created in the lab, we're going to have some significant differences somewhere in one of the 3 objective indices, at least one of the 3 objective indices, because we do have noise that's in the fine structure, and that's most likely going to degrade our responses. So methodology, basically I had 20 to 40 years old, normal hearing participants. We ran this on native Mandarin speakers, which I do want to just throw out a thank you to Yvonne. She's not here, but she did a great job for recruiting Mandarin speakers for me to be able to do this study on. And I had 15 participants, and I compensated them $20 a piece. But not only did I let them sleep, but I also compensated them for their time. They can listen to my stimuli for a little bit. So I presented this at a comfortable 75 dB SPL, And there's some of the nuances of my experiment. Silent interval of 45 milliseconds between each repetition. Each token was presented 4,002 times. I had 3 experimental conditions and a control condition, so each participant listened to about 16,008 sweeps. Actually, the control condition wasn't listening to anything. It was super cool. They didn't hear anything. So that was a nice sleeping time for them. And I do want to mention that since my token is only 150 milliseconds long, the time constraints that Megan presented on weren't as focused as they are in this one because my stimulus is less time than her stimulus was. So the results of the human speech, this is a spectrogram showing the stimuli. So you can see the, I can't see. It's not. So I'm pointing, I have a hard time seeing colors. I cannot see that at all on my screen, sorry. As you can see at 100, you can see that darker area. That's what the stimuli looks like, and it has that rising pitch contour like the E2 stimulus does. And we can see the harmonics going up. That is the stimulus. The grand average response spectrogram, so we have frequency on the y-axis, we have time on the x-axis, and that response is the dark red area right there at 100, and it's rising up just like the stimulus, because that's what we want to do. And you can see a little bit of energy there at the harmonic. The synthesized speech token looked like this. It's a little more jagged than the recorded speech, but this was my first attempt. And you can see that there is energy at the fundamental, right there where that 100 is in the y-axis. It is rising up. There's a little bit more energy at the first harmonic there, which is okay, because the brain has this ability that if you take out the fundamental frequency, you can see that the brain's going to compensate for that, know it's a harmonic, it's going to code at the fundamental frequency. And that's what happened here. You can see this nice response at the fundamental frequency, even though there's less energy in the stimulus, and it's rising up. You can also see there's a little bit more error in this. As you can see, like right through here and down through, it's a little wider. It's not as clean as the recorded speech token was. The hybrid speech token, this is what the spectrogram for the stimulus looks like. So we have the rising pitch contour and its harmonics moving up. Remember, this hybrid speech has noise embedded within the stimuli. And if you take a look at the spectrogram, we do have a response. There's a lot more error in this. There's gaps within the response, but that was what was expected because of the noise degrading that response. And the control condition, we just used the human speech, but we plugged the two so they couldn't hear anything. And of course, all this red here doesn't have a clear pattern, and that's just noise within the brain. Brainstem. So we're looking at the 3 objective indices, and the first one's going to be pitch strength. So that's the overall robustness of your neuronal response within your brainstem. And if you take a look at the E2, you can see that, of course, 0 to 1 on the y-axis, 1 would be the highest and the best. E2, human speech, is about 0.8, 0.8. If you take a look at the synthesized condition, the neuronal response was almost as identical, just a little bit off. No significant differences between the human speech and synthesized speech. And then the hybrid condition was still had a good neuronal response, but it is less than the other 2 conditions. And there's no significant differences between the human and the hybrid, or the synthesized and the hybrid. The only significant differences in this chart was with the control condition, but they're not hearing anything, so we expect that. I'm actually kind of freaked out. So the frequency errors, how far is it coding? How far is it deviating from the fundamental frequency? So we want this to be relatively low. And as you see with the human speech, it is relatively low at about 5 hertz. Synthesized speech, we're looking at like 6, maybe, about 6 hertz. And then if you look at the hybrid condition, there's a lot of error there. And of course, the control condition takes out the error. There are significant differences between the human speech and the hybrid speech, and the synthesized speech and the hybrid speech as well. And this was definitely what my second hypothesis was. There would be a significant difference around this area because the noise is degrading that response. There were no significant differences, however, between the human speech and the synthesized speech. The tracking accuracy is how well is it coding inside the fundamental frequency of the stimulus. And you can see the E2 there is right, peaking out about 0.8. That's where we want see. In the synthesized token, it's not as accurate as I really wanted it to be, but there are no significant differences between the human and synthesized speech, which I really love that. Because this was a success for me. And then the hybrid stimulus was 0.6, and it's not, there were no significant differences anywhere in this chart except for the control condition. So my conclusions are that the study proves that a synthesized speech token, the one that I created, is a viable solution to eliciting FFR responses. And that is in support of hypothesis number 1, and in support of hypothesis number 2, which was that the hybrid speech would not be a viable option because there would be significant differences somewhere. And we did have too much error within the coding, and there's not a lot of pitch strength, not a lot of accuracy within that stimuli. So, but that was expected with the noise degrading those responses. Moving forward, we need to do a little bit more work on the synthesized token, make it a little bit more clean. But it is something that our lab is looking to move forward on in the future, and just overall, we want our research to be using synthesized speech instead of recorded speech. Acknowledgements. I would like to thank Mallory and Megan. They're in my lab, and they're great friends of mine. I've seen them for the last 2 years in our lab, and I just absolutely love being in the lab with them. They've helped out in this project and other projects, and I love you guys a lot. I would like to thank Dr. Ffr Data. We went to Taiwan together as well, and I appreciate the trip to Taiwan. That was life-changing for me. I appreciate your mentorship. I appreciate your mentorship. I have learned a great deal from you. I look forward to learning more from you in the future. And thank you for letting me take the lead on this project and letting me just kind of run with it. I do appreciate that. I'd like to thank Dr. Sean McCarthy. He is the reason I'm standing in front of you right now. He gave me an opportunity that he didn't have to. You changed my life, sir. I'd also like to thank my family and friends and the rest of the classmates who supported us along the way. Any questions?
Mandarin is a language of perfection, I have to say that. And she cannot tolerate any tiny imperfections. And that I think is a very good thing. And so we were in Taiwan as well, and we want students participating in the trip in Taiwan were required to come up with some ideas to do the project of their own. And as you can see her, a beautiful girl. And so we do something that's a compliment to that, a beast. So you have to watch the movie, A Beauty and the Beast. That's what she's representing.
So as Dr. Jim stated, my name is Mallory Marcis, and my project is pitch perception and frequency following responses elicited by lexical tone chimeras. So I myself, as well as Megan and Garrett, all did FFR, so you're going to hear more about it than you'd ever want to in your whole career. So my project focuses on the utilization of auditory chimeras and the FFR technology in a better attempt in how we process those envelope and fine structure cues behaviorally and subcortically. So, referring back to the bees, in our electrophysiology lab, we work a lot with what we call auditory chimeras. Auditory chimeras have been used frequently in the past to examine the level at which we process those envelope and those fine structure cues of an auditory chimera. So, fun fact, they get their name from the analogy of a mythological beast that possesses the head of a lion, the body of a goat, and the tail of a serpent. So to examine the importance of envelope and fine structure cues of an acoustic stimulus, Smith and colleagues synthesized an acoustic signal that contained the envelope of one sound, and they combined it with the fine structure of another sound. The resulting stimulus is what we call an auditory chimera. And I have an example of one shown here. So if you look at the envelope, or the outer portion, which is shown in yellow, and then the fine structure is going to be represented in that middle portion or that blue portion. The resulting stimulus is the auditory chimera. Well, why are they important? So as Megan told you in her study, there are many different pitch contours that all have, many different tones that have different pitch contours. Whether they're rising, and then falling, or dipping, there are many variations. So we have the ability to abstract, say, the rising pitch contour of one tone and combine it with the falling pitch contour of another tone. We can record the brain sense response as to whether we're following those envelope or those fine structure cues. So by using speech-to-speech chimeras that interchange two different speech signals, in 2002, Nature found that the envelope, so that outer portion, dominated a listener's perception. They also found that increasing number of filter banks represented the envelope information became more critical. On the contrary, they found the opposite effect. So when they used melody-to-melody chimeras that interchanged two different melodies of two different stimuli in the fine structure and the envelope, they saw the opposite effect. So the fine structure cues dominated a listener's perception when 16 or less filter banks were used. These findings indicate that envelope information dominates our perception of non-tonal human speech, whereas music or pitch perception is dominated by those fine structure cues. So our knowledge on how the envelope and those fine structure cues contribute to speech understanding is still limited when examining a tonal language that carries both that speech information and that pitch information. So in 2003, Dr. Xu found that using lexical tone chimeras in native speakers of Mandarin Chinese showed a similar effect. So the listeners perceived hearing those fine structure cues as opposed to those envelope cues. Well, what we don't know is whether this phenomenon is unique to native speakers of Mandarin Chinese, because if they do speak that tonal language, or is it going to be universal for both tonal and non-tonal languages. Additionally, there is very little research comparing and contrasting the way we perceive these cues behaviorally and how we process them subcortically through the use of frequency following response technology, as Megan and Garrett already explained to you. It's kind of like an EEG for the brain. So we're able to introduce that sound to the ear and then record how our brain stem is tracking it. So in order to test these ideas, we had to collect data from Chinese participants who spoke a tonal language, as well as our American participants who spoke a non-tonal language, both behaviorally and electrophysiologically. So information collected from the study could potentially help provide insight on how those envelope and those fine structure cues are processed at subcortical levels, as well as help provide insight or help in the speech processing design that go for individuals who receive cochlear implants or hearing aids. So the first goal of this study was to integrate the Ffr technology and the Chimera algorithm in an attempt to better understand the contribution of the envelope and the fine structure cues, first behaviorally and then electrophysiologically. So in order to investigate this, the study was broken up into two separate portions. We have our behavioral portion and our electrophysiological portion, or EP. So for my behavioral hypothesis, it reads that the fine structure cues will dominate a listener's perception, with the Chinese participants showing a stronger diagnostic decision-making abilities due to the familiarity of the Mandarin tokens used. For my EP portion, it is hypothesized that the frequency following response will degrade with increasing number of filter banks, regardless of the listener's linguistic background. So, data was collected from 20 American and 20 Chinese participants, all who had normal hearing. English was the American participants' native language, and Mandarin was our Chinese participants' native language. Two contrastive monosyllabic tones were used. E2, which as you heard, has that rising pitch contour, and then E4, which has that falling pitch contour. So for the behavioral portion, two different sets of chimeric stimuli were used. We used envelope 4, fine structure 2, and then envelope 2, fine structure 4. Each one of those chimeras were ran through 7 different filter rings, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and 64, totaling 14 chimeras. Those 14 chimeras were presented 40 times each to each participant, totaling 560 chimeric stimuli. Through a forced choice paradigm, they had to decipher whether they perceived hearing E2 or whether they perceived hearing E4. For the electrophysiological portion, one set of chimeric stimuli was used. We used envelope 4, fine structure 2. The chimera was ran through the 7 different filter banks, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and 64, and was presented for a total of 2,002 collected sweeps. So for this portion, as well as you know, data was collected when it was easier to collect when the participant was either asleep or in a very restful state. So they were in a soundproof booth with the 3 different gold-plated electrodes attached to their high forehead, their low forehead, and behind their right mastoid. The chimera was introduced into their right ear through an insert earphone at 65 dB SPM. Okay, so here I have the different tones that were used. I know you've heard them already, but I'm going to be playing them again for you. So these are the 2 original stimuli. So E2, again, with that rising contour. Sorry, I know it's loud. And then E4 with that falling contour. Okay. And then the next 2 rows are going to indicate the different chimeras that we use. The middle row is going to be the chimera that was used in both the EP data collection and the behavioral collection through the different filter rings. So I'm going to go ahead and play them for you and try and perceive whether you're hearing that E2, that rising contour, or that E4, that falling contour. So I'm going to quiz you, so pay attention. 4. Cheater. All right. Any takers? Are you hearing that rising contour or that falling contour? Okay. How about at 8? Okay, got some variation. Good. And then how about for the envelope 2 fine structure 4?
I don't know.
Okay, so that's essentially what our participants would have to do through the behavioral portion, except they would hear them 560 times, so I'm letting you off easy. So here's an example, again, of what the Ffr data collection looks like, similar to what Megan showed you, again, but it's on an adult. So you have the 3 different electrodes, one attached to the high forehead, one attached to the low forehead, and then behind the right mastoid, and the sound would be introduced through their right ear. So what does this all mean? Okay, so we'll begin with our behavioral data. Here I have plotted both sets of chimeric stimuli, envelope 2 on the left, fine structure 4 on the right, and then envelope 4 fine structure, or on the left, I'm sorry, and then envelope 4 fine structure 2 on the right. So as you can see, there is a similar trend between the American and the Chinese participants that follow those fine structure cues up until about 16 filter banks in which the response begins to degrade. So up until 16 filter banks, we are using those fine structure cues, similar as to how we would perceive music or pitch perception. With 32 filter banks, the dominance of the fine structure cues began to decline, and then at 64 we saw a swap. So then they started hearing those or perceiving those envelope cues at those higher number of filter banks. Regarding the language background factor, there was a significant difference between the Chinese and the American participants. And you can see that if we look across both sets of chimeras. So our Chinese participants are going to be shown in red. Up until about 16 filter banks, they answered 100% of the time, either that's E2 or that's either E4. Our American participants, shown in blue here, were more indecisive. So sometimes they might have heard E2, or sometimes they might have heard E4. So the Chinese participants showed a stronger dichotic decision-making, again, where the American participants were not as decisive. So behaviorally, we are processing these chimeras as we would music or pitch perception using those fine structure cues. But what about through FFR? So here we have our FFR data plotted in our spectrograms. The top row is going to be our original chimeric stimuli. The middle row is going to be our grand average spectrograms of our American participants. And then the bottom row is going to be our grand average spectrograms of our Chinese participants. The 7 different columns are going to be our 7 different filter banks, 1 on the left, moving up to 64 on the right. So as you can see, the spectrograms show visually identifiable responses that are following those envelope contours of the auditory chimera. So for this one, again, we use the envelope 4 fine structure cue. And since the envelope was 4, you can see that downward pitch contour in both the American and the Chinese participants, up until about 16 filter banks in which the response began to degrade. So quantitative analysis of the accuracy and the magnitude of the FFRs showed a decrease in accuracy or an increase in frequency error at higher number of filter banks, kind of what I just mentioned. So after 16, the response began to degrade. Regarding language background, there is no significant difference between our American and our Chinese participants. For pitch strength, we saw similar trends. Pitch strength indicate that both groups showed a decrease in FFR magnitude with increasing number of filter banks, with the exception of 60 filter banks. So our participants, subcortically through the use of FFR, are relying on those envelope cues as opposed to the fine structure cues that we saw in our behavioral data. So, conclusions. Our American and Chinese participants showed similar perceptual patterns regarding how we're processing those fine structure cues behaviorally in response to those auditory chimeras, regardless of the linguistic background. So even though our Chinese participants did exhibit stronger dichotic decision-making, we still saw similar patterns. Both the American and Chinese participants are responding to those fine structure cues, and they had similar crossover points around 16 and 32 filter banks, in which that envelope information became more important. So the fact that they had similar intersecting points between both groups show that these results are most likely tied to the physiological constraints of the human auditory system. EP-wise, FFRs elicited by the lexical tone chimeras followed those M were clearly identifiable and similar between both groups of our participants. They were both following those envelope cues. So results demonstrate the feasibility of recording the brainstem's response to these auditory chimeras. Well, what did we find from this? So our behavioral results are consistent with the previous literature, indicating the participants have it, or the Chinese participants have that advantage behaviorally, as we stated in our hypothesis. So we assume that they would have better, stronger dichotic decision making. But why are we not seeing a difference at the subcortical levels through the use of FFR? Why are we showing similar and comparable results? So future direction in that area, one possible thought is that the FFR is being processed at cortical levels as opposed to subcortical levels. And the second possibility is that the Chinese participants could be treating them as novel stimuli. So that's kind of where we want to go in the future with that, testing cortically and subcortically the different envelope and the fine structure cues. And again, I would like to thank Dr. Jane for working with me for the past 3 years, as well as Megan and Garrett, who did help me collect my data for this study, as well as Johnny and Grant, who are about to graduate, who helped me collect the Chinese data we have, as well as lots of the rest of my electrophysiological Yes, Dr. McCarthy.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have 2 questions. First is just, what do you tell the people, I guess this is kind of for everybody in your lab, but what do you tell the people when they're participating in your study? You say, go to sleep.
We like
You're
knock them
smart.
out.
Don't ask them any questions.
We have a special drink to give them
What do you
before.
say about what they're going to do?
So we pretty much tell them you're going to hear eat repeatedly, and all essentially that you just need to sleep when we want you to fall asleep because we want to record your brain sense response. The more relaxed you are, the better results that you'll get. And eventually over time you're going to adapt to hearing that sound.
You say you're going to hear E.
Oh yes, yep, you're going to hear over and over and over. And then through the different conditions, we tell them that you're going to hear it stop and then start up again. Don't get up and start moving around until we come in and take the electrodes off.
So my follow-up, thank you. My follow-up then, I don't know about this, but I do know about contacts. I guess I just wondered, like, what if I heard a bunch of speech, and then I heard in your chimera format, and then otherwise I heard some music, and then I heard your chimera. Does that have any impact on how I might perceive or which features I might tend to, depending on what I heard beforehand? Like, sort of find, can you find something to hear it a certain way?
Well, I know we excluded musicians from our study just in long term, not right before the study,
Okay.
but we did exclude musicians because of that tonal experience, which would affect both of them subcortically as well as cortically for the American participants, especially who are not exhibiting as strong of a response. Oh. Yes.
Why did you only use one set of chimeras for the electrophysiological portion instead of 2?
Instead of 2 for the behavioral? So the electrophys portion alone for all the different 7 filter banks, the recordings were about 14 minutes each for each of the 7 different filters. So by the time we prepped our participant, went through the consent forms, scrubbed them, got them to relax, we're already looking at an hour and a half to 2 hours. And then by the time we add the behavioral portion onto that, we were looking at a lot of time. So essentially, ideally, we would like to have used both, but due to time constraints, we couldn't. Yes, Dr.
I would also like to ask 2 questions following Dr. Very straightforward. So there are 4 tones in this language. Is there any particular reason for choosing tone 2 and tone 4? Or fine structure?
So for this one, we used, we only looked at 2 contrastive ones. So we used E2 and E4 because they have opposite contours. So we wanted to see night and day, whether it was a rising contour or a falling contour. You only get one!
I get a 1 mark.
Defining the contrast that we found between the behavioral and the FFR responses is fascinating. That's really, really fascinating. So that basically tells us that while you may encode pitch information at the subcortical level in one way, but behaviorally, that's not going to be predicted from the brainstem response. So this is really a creative question. What do you think this finding will have on the implications on, say, developing measures for evaluation of hearing? Because you're basically looking at a conflict between behavioral responses and this kind of physiological.
Well, I think our next step would be to look at the cortical and subcortical responses separately for both the envelope and the fine structure cues for both sets of participants, and then go see what those findings are, and then see where they're being processed first, and then figure out what we need to do to report that.
Sounds good.
will be on the stage. Okay, longer.
You don't have to, really don't matter.
The question I have is, can you help the audience to understand the crossover in 32 band and 64?
Sure. So the Cochlear has different critical bandwidths and filter rates. So when the bandwidth of the cochlea becomes more narrow towards those higher number of filter banks, though the bandwidth of the stimuli coming in is too wide on that critical bandwidth of the cochlea. So our brain is not able to decipher between those fine structure and those envelope tones at those higher filters. At the lower amount of filters, the critical bandwidth is wider than the bandwidth or the filter banks. So our brain has the ability to decipher between those envelope and those fine structure cues. But at those higher number of filter banks, we're not able to, we physically can't process those fine structure cues. We only have those temporal or those envelope cues to rely on because it's too, that critical bandwidth becomes too
I'm Dr. Mitch. It's my pleasure to introduce our final speakers, Allison and Ty. They have been in my lab for the past year. They have very good, new, exciting data to share with you guys.
Alright, so our presentation is the relative contributions of temporal fine structure and envelope cues to sentence recognition and noise. As Dr. Hsu said, I'm Allison, and obviously that's Kyle. So, what is a cochlear implant? A cochlear implant is a device that directly stimulates the auditory nerve, sending signals to the brain, in which the user interprets those signals as sound. People who receive a cochlear implant are the ones who don't receive benefit from a traditional hearing aid. In recent years, the number of new cochlear implant implantations has been on a steady increase, particularly in China. Mallory gave a wonderful introduction to envelope and temporal fine structure, as it's one way to look at sound as the slow-varying envelope and the fast-varying temporal fine structure. Past studies have assessed these cues and determined that the envelope is critical for detecting fluctuations in speech for non-tonal speech perception and quiet, and the temporal fine structure is important for melody, music, and pitch or intonation perception. In a tonal language like Mandarin Chinese, for example, the temporal fine structure is essential for correct perception of tones. So all sounds, even in something as simple as a bird chirp, has these sounds, or cues. So if we take this sound, you can break it down just a little bit. So on the top is the original signal of the bird chirp, and in the middle, you see this is the envelope. It follows the outline of that original signal, and on the bottom is the temporal fine structure. It's fast fluctuating and fills in all the missing information in here. So cochlear implants,
the technology currently in them, it utilizes the envelope, which really helps for speech understanding and quiet. However, they're not very efficient at implementing the temporal fine structure cues. There are, and has been, new attempts at delivering this temporal fine structure information, but it's been challenging. So past studies have investigated these cues in quiet conditions. However, the contribution of the envelope and temporal fine structure in noise is not well understood. Recently, in 2013, Optogenetic addressed this concern for English speech perception and noise and concluded that English speech perception is mainly extracted from the envelope, while the temporal fine structure does not give much contribution. So, in our study, the question that we proposed was the role and relative contribution of tonal language perception in noise. Is the relative importance of the envelope and temporal fine structure for Mandarin speech perception, is it equal to that of English perception and noise? So we hypothesized that the relative contribution of the envelope and temporal fine structure for tonal language perception will oppose that for English language perception and noise. So in short, we believe that the Mandarin Chinese speakers, they will rely more on the temporal fine structure due to the tonal nature of their language. So our subjects were 17 native English speaking and 9 native Mandarin speaking adults who had normal hearing, and they ranged from age 18 to 38. The materials we used were taken from the English and Mandarin Chinese as bio sentences, which are 33 lists that have 20 sentences each list. The masker we used was a speech spectrum shaped noise, which is a broadband signal that sounds like speech noise, but it's used in a lot of speech studies.
Okay, now in order to actually examine the relative effects of these two acoustic cues, we first had to develop, like in Mallory's study, an auditory chimera stimuli. Like she kind of illustrated, this simply means that we have the temporal fine structure of one sound source paired with the envelope of another sound source. Now in order to actually do this, we first had to combine our stimulus and master into one form, one solid stimulus. And we did this at 5 different signal-to-noise ratios, of -18, -12, -6, 0, and +6. And what I mean by this is simply for the -18 condition, that the noise was just simply 18 decibels louder than the sentence. With -12, the noise was 12 decibels louder than the sentence. All the way until the +6 dB condition, in which the sentence was actually 6 decibels louder than the noise. Once we combined our stimulus and master, we then had to separate this signal into 30 continuous frequency bands. This kind of resembles the way the cochlea or the human hearing organ processes sound, as well as how the cochlear implant processes sound. Each band then went through a chimerizer, which is a very fun word to say and also sounds like some sort of futuristic device. But this next slide kind of goes into depth, a little more in depth about our chimerization. As you can see, you have 2 separate sentences. These are the exact same sentences, just at different signal-to-noise ratios. Each sentence went through a Hilbert transform, which is just a mathematical formula used in signal processing used to break the signal down into its acoustic components. And after that, we were left with the temporal fine structure and the envelope of each sentence. And this allowed us to manipulate each component and test our variables. After we had the acoustics broken down into, we then added a low-pass filter to the envelope just to smooth out the signal as well as to remove any unwanted high-frequency components. We then took this modified envelope and multiplied it with the temporal fine structure of the same signal just at a different signal-noise ratio. The result was a single-band chimeric stimulus. And then if we go back to this previous slide, all these single-band chimeric stimuluses were added together, and our final result was a multi-band chimeric stimulus consisting of -18, or in this example, -18 envelope signal-noise ratio and a +6 signal-noise ratio of temporal fine structure. Using this method, we created 500 processed sentences with varying temporal fine structure and envelope signal-noise ratios. And as for our procedure goes, all of our participants will tested in a sound attenuated booth with super oral headphones, and they were all given a brief training session. This screen here is exactly what the training session consisted of. They could play the sentence as many times as they wished, and they also were provided with feedback. They had this little show me the sentence box in which actually showed the sentence that they were being exposed to. For our test condition, however, there are 500 sentences, and you can only play the sentence to a maximum of 3 times. And there is no longer a show me the sentence box. There was a feedback. So if you didn't know it, you essentially had to guess. And that brings us to some specific examples of what our participants actually listened to. This first example here has a signal-noise ratio of the envelope of -18, and a temporal fine structure of signal-noise ratio of -18 as well. In other words, this was the worst possible condition that they actually experienced. Now that to most people just sounds like static. But you know, there is a sentence being played, but it's very hard to detect, and most people had very extreme difficulty actually. But that sentence actually just says, I just need a little air. Still pretty hard to understand. So for this next example, we have an envelope to noise ratio of -18 and the temporal fine structure of +6. So the worst condition for our envelope and the best condition for our temporal fine structure. It's still pretty hard. You might be able to detect some minor fluctuations in speech, but it's still very difficult to pull out any meaning from the sentence. To most people, it just sounds like static. But that actually says, today we honor a legend. Maybe you might be able to think of it. For this next one here, our envelope was at an SNR of -6, and our temporal fine structure was -18. So a medium condition for our envelope, and a very poor condition for our temporal fine structure. At this point, you can maybe start to detect some fluctuations in speech, but actually pulling the direct meaning out of that sentence is still very difficult. The sentence actually says, can't we all just get along? Once you actually know the sentence, you might be able to understand it, but it's still iffy. For this next one, once again, the envelope is at -6, and here the temporal fine structure is at its best. Still difficult, but you might be able to pull out a word or two, and if you listen closely multiple times, you actually might be able to get the entire sentence. But the sentence actually states, a new baby means you need to be more organized. So for these next 2 examples, our envelope signal noise ratio is at its very best condition. However, for this first one, it's at its worst condition. The temporal fine structure says this.
Isn't this considered cruel and unusual punishment?
So here you can actually start to detect the sentence. It's a lot easier to hear. You don't have to necessarily strain to pull out the meaning. Any guesses on this one? Exactly. And this very last one is when the envelope and the temporal fine structure are both at its best condition. In other words, it was the easiest sentence that our participants actually listened to.
That's quite a mic you have.
Here, you can almost understand the sentence perfectly. It's just you have that little annoying background hiss. And that one actually says, that's quite a mic. So for our data analysis, it was all performed in MATLAB using a custom statistics program. The first thing we had to do was actually calculate percent correct scores for each test condition. And after that, we used the generalized linear modeling to examine the effects of the signal noise ratio and its relative contribution of the temporal fine structure and E on sentence recognition performance index. So these 3 graphs are our results for our Chinese participants. Each one of these 3 graphs shows the exact same data, only in just a different light. So it's very important to actually pay attention to the axes. For this first graph here, on the x-axis, it is the SNR of the E, or the y-axis, percent graph, and the colored lines essentially represent the SNR of the temporal fine structure. So if we just pay attention to this first graph here, as we can see, when the envelope is very poor, sentence recognition scores is almost next to 0. It's nearly impossible to understand what's being said. However, as we gradually increase the envelope scores, the envelope SNR, the sentence recognition scores increased by leaps and bounds. There's also some variation between these lines, indicating that the temporal fine structure does seem to play a minor role in background noise. Moving to this next graph here, like I said, it's the exact same data, just at in a different light. Here are the SNR, the temporal fine structures on the x-axis, and the color lines are represented by the SNR, the envelope. So for this blue line here, when the envelope is at -18, sentence recognition scores are once again next to 0. However, as we increase the envelope, as we increase the signal noise ratio of the envelope, sentence recognition scores increase dramatically. We also see a general slope here, indicating that as we increase the temporal fine structure, there tends to be an improvement in sentence recognition scores. In this colored scheme here, the last graph actually illustrates the contribution of these two cues best, in my opinion. If these colored schemes were completely vertical, straight up and down, that would mean that sentence recognition scores are completely reliant on the envelope. If they're completely horizontal, that would tell us that sentence recognition scores are completely reliant on the temporal fine structure. What we actually see is primarily vertical lines that have some general slope to them, which kind of tells us that for Chinese users in noise, sentence recognition is primarily dependent on the envelope that has a minor implication in the temporal fine structure. When we did our statistical analysis using the generalized linear modeling, we also found out a significant effect from the envelope temporal fine structure, as well as an interaction between these two cues. Meaning that when the envelope is at its best condition, we really don't need the temporal fine structure. However, when in competing environments when the envelope is very hard to detect, or in background noise, or difficult background noise, we tend to use the temporal fine structure a little more. Our English results were very similar, if not actually statistically identical to our Chinese noise. Once again, these three graphs illustrate the exact same data, just in a different light. When envelope scores are very poor, sentence recognition scores are also very poor. As we increase the envelope, we see a huge jump in the sentence recognition scores. Also, there is some variability between the lines, as illustrated by the green line with the +6 SNR, the temporal fine structure, is the highest, and the lowest is -18. So there is some implication from the temporal fine structure as well. Once again, it's easy to see the implication of the temporal fine structure here by these general curves. And once again, with this color scheme, we have primarily vertical lines, however, with some slope. So just like Chinese users, our English participants actually use the envelope cues primarily. However, there is some implication of temporal fine structure in background. And once again, when we did our generalized linear modeling statistics, we came up with a significant effect for both temporal fine structure and envelope, as well as another significant interaction between these two cues.
So in conclusion, our results are consistent with previous results that the sentence recognition is primarily reliant on envelope cues. The temporal fine structure does play a minor but still significant role in noise for both languages, which kind of goes against what we originally hypothesized. So if envelope cues are difficult to hear, the listener might use the temporal fine structure to make up for that. And as Kyle said, the statistical analysis revealed no significant differences between languages. So some clinical implications. Most hearing impaired individuals, as we all know, have the difficulty in competing background noise. So hopefully this will help implement more temporal fine structure in the processing of cochlear implants and hearing aids. So as I said before, it suggests both the envelope and the temporal fine structure does play an important role for noise in both languages. And we would like to thank Dr. Shu, as well as the Auditory Prosthesis Research Lab for aiding us in our research endeavors. Does anyone have any questions?
So when you look at people who have CIs and their ability to perceive music, would that also, if they were able to get more of the temporal fine, what was that for? Sorry. Yes, then would that help them be able to perceive music in like a better way? effect. Thank you.
There was, I noticed we have a number of English and Chinese people take part in the studies. There's specific reason for it.
Pretty much just difficulty acquiring Mandarin Chinese users. Given that it's halfway across the world, communication issues, and they're busy at the Beijing Hospital, so those are just